Thank you so much for the introduction. Guten Morgen, guten Nachmittag. I'm not able to be in Potsdam, but I'm grateful nevertheless for the invitation to speak and the opportunity to share a few reflections here today as a non-historian. I'm a sociologist, and I have quite different stakes in this discursive arena. So the very elements that made Jackie Sibley's jury's play, we're proud to present a presentation about the Herero of Namibia, which I'm going to henceforth refer to as we're proud to present. The things that make it amusing also make it very troubling. The play, which is a meta play about the making of a play, depicts 6 actors attempting to make sense of and present their own dramatized and fictionalized performance of the real life 1904 to 1908 genocide of the Ovaherero and Nama and Ovambanderu and San people. The play quite fascinatingly illustrates how the actors' attempts to recall the timeline of the genocide and parse out what can and should be shared with the audience leads to a deterioration of the production and a traumatizing end to the performance of one of the Black actors. The divergence in the actors' creative priorities, which, do we focus on the German story? Do we focus on the Ovaherero story? Is reminiscent of the messiness of the larger collective project of remembrance and the ways that, who you are largely informs exactly what you're interested in remembering and how. Essential to acknowledgement, after all, is legibility, and legibility is a kind of assimilation. The Ovaherero and Nama genocide is unique in its firstness. Historians largely agree that it's the first kind of bounded genocide of the 20th century. But even this uniqueness or firstness is insufficient to unsettle the foundational nature of indigenous African genocide on the continent, including the transatlantic trafficking and trade in enslaved indigenous African peoples, which is foundational to modernity itself, and which is not unrelated to Raphael Lemkin's own denialist characterizations of this genocide, considering his writings, his kind of ambivalent writings about European colonization in Africa. How can a necessary death then constitute an acute crisis of recognition? Blackness exists within the sub-ontological realm where being human is impossible to claim. And attempting to recognize the subject and to understand the trajectory from full indigenous personhood and sovereignty to native colonial subject means we must refuse this premised universality and an Africanness as opposed to a Blackness that exists solely in its relationship to European coloniality. So what does it mean to tell a people's story, a story of genocide via the humanized perpetrator? Or if not a perpetrator that is humanized, one whose own maturation or spiritual cleansing is actualized through reconciliation or historiographic resolution. It's the same act of narration, a process of narrative construction that compels remembrance and recompense through begrudging and self-flagellating guilt and penance with aspirations towards absolution, as opposed to earnest accounting for wrongdoing. The primacy of the recitation of I'm sorry, or a manipulated and truncated we recognize supersedes and will always be prioritized over the aggrieved and affected communities coming to dictate the terms of reparation or transformative justice. With the staging of Jury's play, the foregrounding of the interaction between the German settler soldier and his wife within this landscape of imperial genocide atrocity feels like an apt illusion for how recollections of phenomena favor the prioritization of psychological profiling or contestations over historiographic situations of event processes over the materialities of communities that were harmed, the peoples who survived the genocide and who exist in the present. Quote, there might be some distant representation of African bodies, but the love is foregrounded, reads one italicized stage direction in the play. Black people, Black Africans, occupy space and they certainly existed in time, but they lack interiority, political agency, and their own expert and objective historiographies. So I want to re-ask and re-emphasize the set of questions that I asked in my piece that was a kind of secular response to Dirk's essay, The German Catechism, in a kind of set of responses that was really beautifully curated by Jennifer Evans. And I wrote that the glaring response in this debate, or absence in this debate around continuity, both the kind of historical and contemporary iterations of the discourse, is that of Black study and of Black peoples themselves. That there's been a shocking deprioritization and disinterest in both living and dead Black people that the consideration of deceased and living and speaking Black Africans has almost been wholly abstracted as subjects of historical contemplation, even though they're currently enduring continuing conditions of colonial dispossession and still demanding recompense and restitution for their suffering. What is the function of depoliticizing attempted extermination as an ideological matter, as though there are not, per the dictates of the state system, clear and distinct motivations for othering, demonizing, and attempted extermination? What if the story were to begin with indigenous Namibians rejecting the recent German offer for recognition, which I'll circle back to in a moment, rather than that critical rejection being relegated to an end of story afterthought in the majority of news coverage? What if African materialities comprised a major core of the debate rather than simply our interpretations of the violence of their oppressors? And what if the Ovaherero and Nama and Ovabandero and San people were entrusted as suitably reliable narrators, such that we held their worldviews, historical interpretations, ongoing traumas, and calls for reparations as our defining truths? There's a moment in the play that really ossifies the stakes, or if perhaps not the stakes, the kind of underlying topographies of this debate that seems to be professionally captured by historians. Sometimes to the exclusion of others, an irony sometimes, because what is the function of public history if not a vehicle for clarifying the present through an extrapolation of conclusions and implications? The play slips back and forth between process and presentation, between the rationale of the actors and their performative conclusions, between the negotiations of memory and the presentations to be publicly observed and reflected upon by audiences comprised of the public writ large. In this part of the process, the actors are grappling with the current state of representing Ovaherero people in the play. Someone arguing that the focus of the wife's letters to her husband failed to reveal anything about the facts of genocide or the people murdered by the imperial force that the loving, longing husband represented. They go back and forth about improvisation, that they shouldn't be making things up and shouldn't be doing anything other than what's real, but that they're focusing on the woman's letters because they're the only thing that they actually know. The letters are the only first-person accounts of the genocide, Actor 2 claims indignantly. The letters don't have any evidence of anything happening to Africans. They don't mention one prison camp, one hanging, one incident. Actor 1 chimes in saying, "I'm not saying the genocide was made up. I'm just saying we don't have physical evidence." He's just saying it's not like the Holocaust, says Actor 5, making explicit the political analogy at the heart of the debate. Quote, "With the Holocaust, we have documents, we have testimonials, we have pictures," says Actor 1. 6 million people, and we know all of their names, every single one. A dramatic characterization and overstatement that nevertheless encapsulates the ontological transformation of the Nazi genocide from the particular to the epochal, that is, definition setting, morally and politically universalized. Among other things being debated here is a racialized politic of witnessing. While historical memory can be and should be, per Michael Rothberg, multi-directional and relational rather than a canonized linear memorialization as zero-sum competition, the Jewish survival witness is necessarily being pit against the Ovaherero and Nama descendant witness. Both communities embody and transmit intergenerational memory, though. There necessarily remains an animated vigilance, mourning, and remembrance of the Shoah within Jewish communities, even amongst generations of people who did not experience Nazi racial terror. Similarly, Ovaherero and Nama community members express an intensity of confrontation and understanding of violence in the present. For example, many people above a certain age were raised by survivors of the German genocide in the former Southwest African colony. Sima Lupert, Israel Kauna Shike, and other Ovaherero and Nama activists and community members describe a keen understanding of their relatively lighter skin as being attributed to German grandparentage and colonial sexual violence. Community members understand, especially Nama people and their leadership as articulated by the Nama Traditional Leaders Association. They're very clear and consistent about the need for contemporary address of the land question in Namibia, because their ongoing landlessness was initiated by imperial German dispossession, perpetuated by the apartheid regime, and then subsequently by the post-independent SWAPO regime, as well as the fact that a fair proportion of the minority population of white Namibians who own a majority of land within Namibia are German-speaking Namibians, many of whom hold dual citizenship with Germany and who are descended from German settlers. And yet, despite the clarities and continuities, it is often a remembering that barely registers. In the preface of Nazik Armanakian's 2015 photo book, Survivors, in which he photographs nonagenarian survivors of the Armenian genocide, philosopher Mark Nishanian describes the image, the survivor image, as a relic. The catastrophe, the annihilatory violence of the Ottoman Empire, was described as yeger, meaning crime or catastrophe, prior to the coining of genocide as a neologism, is immortalized in a particular way through Armanakian's portraits of survivorship. He writes that one can narrate these things and bear witness for them, but that is not the way in which the catastrophe will ever appear. That is not how it will be captured, unless the picture shows the image as a relic. That is how the face of the survivor is seen as a face of survivor. If the reconveying and rearticulating and relitigating of trauma for purposes of acknowledgement and recognition is a trauma in itself, how do we craft capital T testimony from testimony? How would we immortalize a moment or a memory, quote, except to show the picture as a relic and turn each face into its own image, thus transforming it into the face of a real survivor, rather than the face of just anybody. Relic in ancient Armenian is neshkar, he explains. Stripped of contemporary theological connotations, it simply refers to a remnant. Nishanian invokes Armenian writer Hagap Ushagan and his own use of the word neshkareal in reference to himself and other Armenian intellectuals whose arrests and deportations marked the beginning of the genocide. He writes that they were, quote, transformed into relics, but also remain as relics in our memories. The survivor is a remnant, that is, what remains after the death of the witness, and thus as a relic, or further, one who has returned from death. The questioning of narrative reliability inevitably inflects upon the contours of this debate, depending on one's subjectivity, intellectual and/or political investments, or discursive commitments. The positioning of German imperialism broadly, and this genocide specifically, can be understood as a German story about Namibia or a Namibian story about Germany. It is, of course, both, but it is most widely spoken about as here as the former. The genocide in German Southwest Africa unfolds through the familiar politic of Lebensraum, an exportation of Germanness into overseas colonies from the metropole in attempts to establish an overseas space comparable to the metropole. Lebensraum, as we know, was a production of racial geography and the romantic nationalist ideal that characterized Imperial German and then Nazi settler expansionism. Living space, after all, is incomplete without the corresponding removal in whatever manner the specific racialized nation-state project entailed to make it livable. Germany's settler colonial expansion in Africa was a colonization marked not simply by the desire to cultivate a captive labor force to accelerate the colony's development, but also one of establishing dominion land, which necessitated the elimination of native people. And the wartime genocide was achieved through the weaponization of desert spaces and the production of mass deaths within concentration camps. While what Elizabeth Baer describes as a genocidal gaze made permissible and justifiable Germany's apparent right to annihilate indigenous Africans at will, centuries of contemptuous regard for Black Africans by European colonizers led to racial characterizations and treatments of native people as barely more sophisticated than animals. The animalization of native Africans through eugenic science further nullified African land claims and enabled Europeans to impose their own juridical notions of ownership and also personhood and subjecthood and Western legality. The uses of introduced European property regimes as a means of understanding ownership were co-produced with structures of race, which enabled the voiding of indigenous land claims and introduced a racially stratified schema of subjecthood that complemented ongoing colonial accumulations of land and other resources, including human ones. Classical legal theory was made global through an internationalized system of law, including the one that criminalized genocide through the liberal codification of human rights, that posited European sovereignty as super sovereign within a colonial sphere. And it is through this subjugation that whiteness came to be constituted with property ownership and Blackness as property through a process of what Fanon calls epidermalization. that this racial schema is projected onto the bodies of Black and African people. And within this juridical regime of land and color-based identity, there established the clear distinction between European dominion over land and the mere occupancy or lesser possession of indigenous people. The introduction of property law specifically bestowed the land that would become the colony to its rightful European owners. It is this very notion then of property rights, rights that designated a capacity for and a right to land ownership, that also designated a claim to humanity, because the Western man and human bestowed with rights were imagined in service of the construction of a colonial world, and so were inextricably linked to the state and the nation. Human rights, quote, human rights law aspires to name, define, call into being, redeem the human through the transformation of what should be some innate or inalienable condition to a legally informed socio-political status, or what Samara Esmer describes as juridical humanity. This codification of humanity, established by human rights conventions, institutionalizes racial hierarchies within and through the very structure of human rights itself. This tension, of course, is at the root of the purportedly universalizing international legal standard of the crime of genocide. The desire to maintain these structures of coloniality produces contestations of genocidal reality. Despite the creation of the crime and its constituent acts, there remains debate about what actually constitutes genocide, and so when to deploy the term in response to contemporary or historical, particularly colonial crimes. This tension revolves arguably around what is understood to be a killable or unkillable person, around which individuals and communities are afforded full standing as human under the law. The genocidal will, Mark Nishanian writes in describing both a legal and philosophical impulse, is that which wants to abolish the fact in and through the very act that establishes the fact, which then also pertains to, quote, the manner in which the memory of events is constituted for civilized humanity. Discussions of genocide within the context of colonial violence become difficult and paradoxical because, quote, the African anthropos within the zone of non-being cannot suffer human rights abuses because they are not human. Culpability for genocide is also informed by this ideological genesis of property rights, that is, a legal subjecthood revolving around the singular citizen subject. It is, therefore, a part of the Eurocentric framing of genocide that responsibility for perpetrating acts of mass atrocity resides with guilty individuals and government/political regimes as opposed to entire nation states. The watershed judgment at Nuremberg declared that, quote, crimes against international law are committed by men, not by abstract entities, and only by punishing individuals who commit such crimes can the provisions of international law be enforced. And in asking such questions about complicity, international legal precedent has grappled with the tension of whether the real lead for genocide is the state or the agents working on its behalf, which then bears implications for understanding the afterlives of these genocides when the originators and the original enactors of the genocide are no longer living and when they have never been formally tried in a court of law. What is the role of each then when thinking of the state or its agents? There is no question that the state can only act through its agents. But on the other hand, the agents, if acting within their powers, are acting only for and on behalf of the state. When genocide is committed, upon whom then must the curtain fall? Is the responsibility of one dependent on the other, end quote. In the case of genocides committed before 1948/1951, which is when the Genocide Convention was ratified, with the absence of individuals responsible for its incitement and execution, is justice simply a foregone conclusion, although the material and spiritual and economic violences are resonant in the present. Although financial restitution is an important, let me take a drink of water, sorry. Although financial restitution is an important part of Ovaherero and Nama reparation demands, the nature of transformative justice articulated by the NTLA and other organizations is a sovereignty-affirming restorative justice that reverses the century of enclosure and loss of ancestral land initiated by German settler colonization. Where acknowledgement of genocide unfolds before a passive and spectatorial international community, and where retrospective recognition is avoided because of its political inconvenience, Inaction or incomplete acknowledgement is tantamount to a kind of genocide denial. This is an especially damning charge considering Germany's statements throughout the lawsuits proceedings, the recently kind of dismissed lawsuit in which Ovaherero and Nama plaintiffs sued the German government. In court, Germany described well-documented genocidal phenomena as alleged seizures of land and livestock, alleged murders of tens of thousands of people, systematic rape, and uses of concentration camps. It is common legal parlance to use alleged in describing contested acts or violations that have not been litigated and or convicted in a court of law. However, law and historiography exist in different domains of facticity. As Nishanian opens his book, The Historiographic Perversion, quote, genocide is not a fact because it is a very destruction of the fact, of the notion of a fact, of the factuality of the fact. The existing historical consensus of phenomenon is neither legally binding nor obligating. Historians' agreement that Germany was responsible for the attempted extermination of Ovaherero and Nama people is not the same as the conclusion of responsibility from a legal ruling or international tribunal. Thus, Germany's, via its legal representation, use of alleged in describing documented and widely affirmed genocidal violences, violence largely confirmed by the government in subsequent political gestures towards financial settlement and acknowledgement, is attempting to exploit these semantic ambiguities and slippages. It is attempting to expedite the process of reconciliation without ever having actually delivered an apology or reparations. One part of the Namibian story of Germany is the story that was argued in court, where Ovaherero and Nama plaintiffs argued that the land stolen by Germany was indigenous communal land, regardless of whether it was formally recognized as such by imperial land tenures. Because the skulls and other human remains that comprise Felix von Luschan's teaching collections that were taken from the stolen land, from excavated graves, from geological surveys, from the concentration camp dead, because they were taken from stolen land, they belong to the descendants of survivors, and not to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, whose acquisition from von Luschan's widow represented an unlawful commercial exchange as opposed to sovereign activity, and therefore voided Germany's claim to sovereign immunity. Part of this legal brief reads, quote, Germany's logic was that the Ovaherero and Nama faced extinction by genocide. Samples of these two peoples must be preserved for science and posterity. These takings were thus the souvenirings of genocide, and so a continuation of the same, which makes the American Museum of Natural History as much a locus of Germany's crimes as Shark Island itself. A taking's character is also reflected by its methods. Here, for example, forcing women prisoners to remove the flesh from boiled heads of their own kin. Germany sought to cause maximal loss, extract all profit from its slaves down to their skulls, and reinforce white supremacy through dehumanization. By taking these skulls, Germany's message was not only that the Herero and Nama lives did not matter, but that they were not really human lives at all. At a press conference in August 2020, the now late Ovaherero paramount chief, Vekwi Rukoro, recasted the German government's qualified and circumventive recognition that kind of had the atrocities been committed today, they would amount to genocide, in his own interpretation of pre-1948 criminalizations of exterminatory violence. He said, quote, our lawyers argue that the court should apply the international law of the era, including the 19th century prohibition on genocide recognized by the Restatement of International Law of 1868. Restatement was a codification of binding customary international law, and Section 535 of the Restatement states clearly, quote, wars of extermination and annihilation against people and tribes capable of life and culture are violations of international law. Don't the Herero and Namas of the time fall within this definition? And was what happened to them not exactly that? Unless you want to argue that, my goodness, yes, we were not humans, we did not have life, and we did not have culture. We were objects, which is exactly what the Germans were arguing in court. While the German government has previously acknowledged the genocide via the Minister of Development's public apology on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Waterberg, which was subsequently dismissed by the German government as a personal statement and not being indicative of any formal change in government policy. It has since ruled out formal compensation and financial reparation for the communities, instead preferring to engage its culpability for genocide through bilateral relations with the Namibian nation state in exclusion of survivor groups, and whose participation in handover ceremonies has been multiply insulting to Ovaherero and Nama delegations. The German government has been clear that the repatriation of skulls should not be used as a part of larger effort to engage imperial atrocities committed against Namibian peoples. And if the skulls were used as a driver for comprehensive genocide reparations, it could compromise the good standing that Namibia has enjoyed as a recipient of German aid and financial support. And this is a sentiment that has been evoked by both German and Namibian politicians alike, that the return of these remains ought to represent a conciliation between the two countries, and that closure of the atrocities of colonial Germany. Never mind that such declarations from both parties do not reflect the entirety of the multiplicity of ideas and feelings held by leadership and members of the affected communities. As after a rejected compensation offer of 10 million euros was made in late 2020, Germany's 2021 promise to acknowledge the genocide was coupled with an offer to pay $1.1 billion to existing aid programs over 30 years, which comes out to about the same amount of annual development funding that Germany has given Namibia since independence in 1990. Another part of the Namibian story, rather, a story from peoples indigenous to Namibia, is that Westphalian sovereignty is incompatible with indigenous self-determination. The nation states, former colonizers, and independent states, as less than unlikely bedfellows, will engage in bilateral collusion, celebrated by some as reconciliation, at the expense of the political demands made by survivors. So thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much. So you've shocked me in many respects. I guess that's a feeling shared by some in the audience. And I'm wondering if there are questions. Ganz kleinen Moment, warten Sie bitte auf das Mikrofon, sonst kann Zoe Sie nicht hören.
Well, I think you brought out very well the deficiencies of the German official response to the demand for apology and reparation, and of course recognition of the genocide. I would simply add a tiny but important point about the legal argument of the German Foreign Office in New York, and I think that was very telling. They actually invoked more or less colonial law, namely the idea that at that time indigenous people could not be legitimate belligerents. And there's a long story, I don't want to go into it, that the protection treaties that were concluded at the beginning of German rule in the 1880s to 1890s in Namibia actually amounted to acts of international law. And therefore, the commanding general was not right, even in formal terms, that the Hague Convention was not applicable. And if that is actually the case, then the German government, as the lawyers of the Foreign Office were probably well aware, would actually be liable to damages. That's just a tiny, could add a lot of more, but leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Benjamin.
So my question and observation is somewhat related. I think you say early on that, I think I'm quoting, Lemkin is ambivalent in his writings on European colonization in Africa. And I wondered if you had some examples for us. And following on from that, since later on, the crucial part of the argument is that the Convention on Genocide is not applied to the case, that are you actually saying that Lemkin's definition would have been useful there or would not?
Yeah, thank you. So when I talk about his kind of ambivalences, there's a way, obviously, in his creation of the definition of genocide that he derives a lot of it from significant study of European coloniality. And in that kind of condemnation of settler violences, for example, of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, when he talks about Africa, there are some kind of, some slippages in the kind of force of his condemnation. So when he talks, for example, about the Belgian colonization of the Congo, yes, he talks about the kind of violences and the brutalities, but he also spends a significant amount of time, talking about the ways that Native people were complicit and colluded with the colonial forces. When he talks about the Ovaherero and Nama genocide as well, rather than this kind of outright condemnation of German settler colonization of Southwest Africa, instead he mentions that, instead of using a settler model, that the Germans should have used indirect rule as the British did, because it would have allowed the Ovaherero and Nama to retain elements of their kind of cultural structures and indigenous sociality, because what Germany effectively did with settler rule was to destroy and to deliberately destroy Ovaherero and Nama and Banderu and San life. And he also does take up some denialist arguments, even though his description of what happened to the Ovaherero and Nama was quite, quite kind of unambiguous in being identifiable as genocide. He takes up this kind of race suicide thesis that was forwarded by a number of colonial apologists, and basically saying that after, Rinderpest wiped out the cattle, and after the cattle were unjustly expropriated, and after the Ovaherero and Nama were put into camps, they kind of lost the will to live. And so they brewed this alcohol that completely shattered their productive and reproductive capabilities. And so that is why their numbers dwindled, because they simply were consuming this beer because they had lost the will to live. So that's what I mean. It's not to say that, even in his own words, that he would not have characterized it as a genocide, because even though the term was not applied, all of what comes to define his understanding of genocide is used and deployed. He just comes to kind of different conclusions about colonial rule.
I think there's a follow-up question.
Okay. Yeah, so there was a follow-up question, which was, in that case, would it have been preferable to use Lemkin's definition or not? But you introduced another layer just there when you said they didn't use an indirect rule model. Are you suggesting that the indirect rule model was somehow better?
That's not what I said. That is what Lemkin wrote. I don't think that there's any better model of colonization as a Zimbabwean person. Like that, there's no better model of. I don't understand the question.
I mean, I wanted firstly to clarify that that's not what you were saying, but then I had the follow-up question in the beginning, which said, you then base your narrative of the trial on the fact that they try to avoid using the Convention on Genocide as a definition in the legal case. And I'm asking if you would suggest that the Lemkin derived definition is better than the precedent that they actually tried to use, or would it have given more traction to a legal case?
Well, I think that there's a whole kind of legal discourse about kind of retrospective application that I'm not particularly versed in. But I think that what the German state's argument is, more than anything, is that what happened after genocide was a crime, or before genocide was officially a crime. And so there's a kind of,
yeah. Nuremberg was also retrospective legislation in many ways.
Okay.
So, I mean, again, all of that legislation, including the trials in Japan of Japanese war criminals, was based on an attempt at retrospective legislation. So it's interesting that the German side got away with saying we don't want retrospective legislation here. So I wondered, yeah.
Well, I think that simply has to do with the kind of will that the international community has in holding colonizers responsible for their crimes.
Maybe it's important to clarify that the case was never adjudicated according to its legal merits.
Right.
All the circuit court in New York, two instances of the circuit court in New York did was to find that it was not the legal stand to actually treat the matter. So the legal merits of the whole thing are formally open.
Yeah.
Well, to the speaker and to me, they're not open, but in formal terms, they are open. One other thing about the indirect rule, of course, that is a really spurious argument in the case, because in the area of European settlement in Namibia, which is not all of the territory, the northern parts have been subjected to indirect rule. The expropriation of indigenous communities was instrumental in instituting commercial agriculture. So the whole system actually hinged on that, and basically on the genocide.
We have two more questions. Can we have the lady in the back, please? The lady in the back, please. And then you.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, so much for this talk. It was really insightful and brought in a very different perspective, also from what we've heard. And I was interested in what you said about which records are kept, or which kinds of records we have, and how written records are considered more kind of legitimate, right, documentation of witness. And it made me think of debates about archives as political entities in some ways, right? And Eliza Left's recent article on that, and how we have to consider that in our work as researchers also. And I'm curious about your thoughts, one, on that, and then also kind of the question of what, if you have any thoughts of what records of the Namibian genocide could look like. Like, I'm thinking of oral histories or other ways of, if you're talking about the intergenerational narratives that are still present, like ways of somehow capturing that, and what that could look like in a way that is coming from the descendants and not kind of enforcing a kind of record keeping by the perpetrators or their descendants. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Archival kind of recording is incredibly fraught. And, you know, something that was really striking to me when I went to the National Archives in Windhoek was, you know, when I was kind of looking through the index, there was a note that said there was a chunk of the colonial records specifically about military administration that was missing because they had been destroyed. So some of them had been destroyed in Windhoek, some of them had been sent back to Berlin and were subsequently destroyed during World War II, and then other records were sent to Pretoria, or were in Pretoria, and so are somewhere kind of in South Africa. And so there's something very interesting about the kind of internationalization of these archival records, which really speak to the transnational resonances and reaches of the afterlife of this genocide. And I'm always so interested in, you know, whenever I hear people saying, you know, we couldn't find Indigenous Africans in the record, it's like the absence is a presence, right? So-called native policy that is being constructed by Germans is the presence of indigenous people in the record. And so it's a matter of kind of the vantage point from which you're interpreting. You can make inferences and draw cross-references about indigenous materiality based on the nature of the policy that is documented. So I think that there ought to be a little bit of kind of creativity in the ways that the interpretations and the readings of the records is done. And I think, to your second question about what could the records look like, I think that orality is incredibly important. And the thing about orality sometimes is that it's often not in English, it's often not translated, and it's something that is often not accessible to us as Westerners or non-Ovaherero or, Khoi speaking people. But I also do feel that opacity is something that is very important. That lack of accessibility is something that is very important, especially when dealing with something as fraught as kind of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational memory. But there are very interesting books that have been published. For example, there's a book called Mama Pene, Transcending the Genocide, which is the grandson of a genocide survivor who's actually the fictionalized character in Marie Serabov's Mama Namibia. And he, writes the story of her survivorship, of her navigation of kind of German coloniality after the war is over, her navigation of apartheid. And I think that, texts like that are incredibly important. And I think it's just a matter of who has the will to support the creation of texts if people are so willing and so desire, and how these kind of projects can be funded and brought to, someone put in the chat the oral history written by Kashivena. It was a wonderful book. I went to the lunch in Windhoek. So I think that there are different projects, and I think that oral histories, are an incredibly important and actually incredibly historically reliable source of information.
Just as an aside, I think as historians, we talk far too little about archives as institutions and on destroying records rather than keeping them. But there's another question back here.
Hello to California, Zoe. Thank you so much for your work. I have more of a comment than a question because it seems to me, particularly in this symposium where we juxtapose genocide of the Jewish population, and not only the Jewish population in Europe, and what happened in Southwest Africa. But I think, because I think the problem is one, frankly speaking, of racism. European children, German children continue not to learn very much at all about African history. Africans continue to be people without history to a significant extent. So the popular support for what happened in Africa 100 years ago plus is not really of much interest to most people, because in fact, Africa is too far away, too removed, and too much, and the view of Africa continues to be too influenced by white superiority and racism. And that's my comment. Thank you.
Cannot help but agree.
Any more questions from the audience? Not from the chat audience either? Oh, I have one. I was struck by your distinctions between states and agents as regards juridical questions, who to prosecute. And it now seems to me, after all you told us, that there's also a distinction between state and survivor-descendant. Who is to call the shots about what constitutes acknowledgement or reparation? How do you think can one shift this rather skewed balance?
Okay, let me start over again. I think, Ovaherero and Nama people, one of the most important things that I have read, in the collection of statements from the Nama Traditional Leaders Association has been the ways that they talk about the kind of narrative crafting of Namibian history via SWAPO. So if you go to the Independence Museum in Windhoek, the way that it's kind of structured is this kind of like pre-colonial, so cave drawings and, you know, indigenous folks of like far antiquity. And then you kind of get into colonization, and what you're looking at are pictures of the genocide that don't actually tell you that there's a genocide happening. But if you know what you're looking at, you know you're looking at a genocide, but if you don't, it's just colonization. After that is this kind of discussion about the growth of apartheid, the administration of Namibia as a province kind of apartheid South Africa, and then you have SWAPO and the liberation struggle, and then independence. And so as you see through the kind of state narrative, Ovaherero and Nama people don't exist in the present, right? After colonialism is the birth of SWAPO, and the story, the triumph of Namibia is the triumph of SWAPO over apartheid. And so what kind of happens in this kind of patriotic history and this discursive turn from the Ovaherero and Nama genocide to the Namibian genocide, and someone helpfully clarified that there were kind of different zones of colonial administration. There was a kind of indirect rule in the north, and this kind of very pronounced settler colonial rule in the central and southern parts of the country. Is this conflation of modes of colonial administration, and this kind of the particularities of Ovaherero and Nama targeting by the Germans becomes this part of this Namibian story, as a part of the Namibian SWAPO triumph over coloniality. And so this is the way, the patriotic history is the way in which the government becomes authorized to engage in bilateral negotiations with the German government, because everyone was affected by German colonization. And so everyone is struggling to overcome these histories. And so everyone, or the government then, is entitled to speak on behalf of all of Namibian people. But in fact, there is a very particular demand by Ovaherero and Nama people, as I said in my remarks, to address the land question, to engage ongoing dispossession and landlessness that was continued that was continued after it was initiated by Germany. So there's always this tension between indigenous communities and the state, because what they're asking for is sovereignty. That is the reparation that they're calling for, and not simply the sum of money from Germany, even though they are obviously asking for financial recompense. Like this is why I'm so invested in reading and following how they are understanding the genocide, because this is much larger than the contours of the Windhoek to Auschwitz thesis. It's about land, it's about life, it's about the fact that there are still Ovaherero and Nama people who have to ask German-speaking Namibians permission to bury their family on what was their ancestral land. And so there is this tension around land, this tension around belonging, around citizenship, around sovereignty that is being completely elided by bilateralism, and that is a massive problem.
Thank you very much, Zoe. And I think, well, there's some more questions from the chat.
Yeah, not really questions, but I think this shouldn't be left unmentioned. There are lots of comments who say thank you for the great talk and very much affirmation, and that shouldn't be lost. So I just wanted to mention it.
And I'd like to add that I would like to convey in all our names our thanks for a very moving presentation and a good discussion. Thank you very much. I do hope you can follow a little bit of our conference on the web. Thank you. And thank you all. I suggest we take a 5-minute, get yourself a coffee, water break before we continue with Benjamin Zachariah.